I'm Michelle Makori, and this is Kitco News coming to you from New York. President Biden will be unveiling part one of his two-pronged massive infrastructure plan on Wednesday. And the proposal is expected to total between $3 and $4 trillion. Now, to foot this bill, the Biden administration has been eyeing big tax increases with wealthier Americans and corporations as the primary targets. Joining me to discuss that and so much more is Dr. Ron Paul, former congressman and current host of the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Dr. Paul, thank you so much for joining us on Kitco.
Michelle, it's nice to be with you.
Great to have you, Dr. Paul. All right, let's start off by looking at the first part of this infrastructure bill, because it's expected to focus on rebuilding roads and bridges, expand clean energy investments, and create infrastructure for electric vehicles. Some are calling this a Trojan horse for the Green New Deal. Now, while the plan was initially thought to have a $3 trillion price tag, it now could cost as much as $4 trillion, and that could include a $3.5 trillion tax hike. So, Dr. Paul, what impact do you think the first part of this infrastructure bill is going to have on the U.S. economy?
Well, hopefully it would do something positive, but most likely it'll do what those kind of programs always do. You know, spend a lot of money. They're inefficient. They're always cost more than they thought they should. And besides, it's built on some mystical belief that you shouldn't have any concern about deficits. You shouldn't have any concern about what they're going to do with those deficits at the Federal Reserve. It's just more, everybody's in a dream. And this is part of it. So I would think that this is, worse than average. Most of the time people say, well, this is a little bit too much and we ought to be cautious, and they have some people warning. But this is probably the most outrageous thing ever, considering what has been spent in the last year. And that was on top of us trying to come out of a recession that lasted for many, many years. And also, I think before coronavirus, our recession, our correction was already in motion. So I think this dream, they're convinced that deficits don't matter. They claim that what we have been doing, if you exaggerate it, you call it modern. It's a modern monetary theory. Well, the theory's been around a long time, but this is an insane monetary theory, and it causes a lot of harm. And I just think it's building now. And one of these days it's going to break loose, and people are going to lose confidence in the purchasing power of the dollar. They just can't keep doing this. Other than if they can, they have defied all kind of common sense and history that all you have to do is have a monopoly monetary system, just print out the money. So for a while it lasts, and since there's a theory about the subjective theory of value, you can kid and fool people for a while. But eventually, this is going to lead to a great disaster, this type of spending. And I think the roads will continue to erode.
Well, we'll get to the impact that this could have on the dollar in a moment, but I want to focus on why you think this has become such a big issue in the United States. If we look at the second part of the bill, I mean, that is focused on the so-called care economy. And that bill is expected to include the largest expansion of their welfare state since LBJ's Great Society. It's going to include items like universal preschool, free community college, childcare, dependent care, paid leave. This is all supposed to be part of the package that's going to be announced at a later date. So what do you make of that? How did the U.S. government get so far to the left again?
Well, it's part of this dream. Everything they do in Washington is for political reasons. They don't have a desire to promote sound economic policy. In the old days, there was an attempt that, they would recognize that deficits are bad, and they'd recognize that free market interest rates were beneficial, and there'd always be a limit to it. But there isn't any now. And so the consequence is horrible. And I think it really got started in recent years, back in 2019, when the overnight rates exploded upward, saying this system isn't functioning, and interest rates had to go lower, lower, lower. Since it doesn't make any sense, there's always going to be a political need. Right now, it was all exaggerated by coronaviruses, because then we had the lockdown, and this has made the economy much, much weaker, but we were dealing already with a deeply flawed system, a lot of malinvestment, a lot of debt, debt has to always be paid for one way or the other. It can be paid for by people working harder, or it can be paid for by devaluing the currency, and that is pay your bills off with printing press money.
Well, Dr. Paul, you're correct that the pandemic certainly served as an excuse and an accelerator, if you will, for these socialist policies. But the trend towards socialism and leftist policies was happening way before the COVID pandemic and really taking a hold of American politics. Why do you think the United States is being pulled more and more to the left?
Because I think of the failure of the system. We really, because they divide everything up into right and left, and right is conservative and free markets, and there's the difference. No, it's a consequence of what you should expect when government is involved. And both parties are very interventionist. And, you know, they fight and fume over power. But in reality, they have the same policy. So if you're dealing with a policy, they're not trying to correct what was the policies that were mistakenly given to us by the right, because the right believes in deficits. They believe in warmongering. They believe in the Federal Reserve. They share that. When they're fussing and fuming over things in the Congress where they're trying to impeach the president, they all show up to vote to spend the money. So it doesn't matter. And there's been a few things out in the last couple of years, and that is because it's a failing system, because it can't work, they've had to resort to even more spending, more benefits, more handouts, and also more protectionism, thinking that, well, we're not as competitive, we have to do something. And it works into the foreign policy that there's more sanctions put on, more tariffs put on. And there was a time 10, 15 years ago, there was a significant segment of the economy intended to be more conservative, that they weren't excited about tariffs. But now we use tariffs and we use these sanctions. And so we're looking for increasing the disturbance internationally. I think we have a global problem too. When you look at what's happened with our foreign policy in Syria and the Middle East and Afghanistan, Afghanistan's never going to end. I guess we ought to prepare for another 20 years. You're going to see an end to the dollar before we're going to see us leave Afghanistan and the Middle East and getting out of Syria.
Dr. Paul, I do want to get your thoughts on foreign policy, but first let's focus more on the Fed. And you've always been very vocal in your criticism of the Fed. And now there's growing concern that we're seeing the Fed and central banks around the world, in fact, losing their independence, that fiscal, monetary policy, and political agendas are becoming far too intertwined. Yellen, former Fed chair, is now the Treasury Secretary, and we're seeing a similar pattern happening in Europe with ECB head Mario Draghi, now Italy's prime minister. And this potential loss of independence and the blur between government and central banks was recently highlighted by Senator John Neely Kennedy. Let's watch.
I see every day central banks getting more and more involved in fiscal policy and lobbying legislators with respect to the adoption of fiscal policy. I've noticed that the Bank of England has announced in its QE program that it is going to stop purchasing corporate bonds from companies that it thinks has too big of a carbon footprint. I've noticed recently that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has decided it's going to start in its policy making, its monetary policy, taking account of housing prices. Now, this is where I'm headed, Mr. Chairman. The Federal Reserve needs to maintain its independence in America. Your credibility depends on political independence. I give you Turkey if you don't believe me.
So, Dr. Paul, the big picture here that Senator Kennedy is painting is that this is a phenomenon worldwide, that central banks and government policies and political agendas are getting too intertwined as opposed to being independent of one another. Do you see that?
Oh, yeah. I think it's just a feeble attempt to try to rescue a system that is bankrupt. I mean, this whole system is bankrupt. It is not workable, so they do this. But this whole idea of independence, I just don't believe that they're interested in independence. They're interested in secrecy, because I don't think of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve and the fiscal people and the Congress as really representing a whole lot, because I think about the people that we place in the shadow government, in the deep state, because there's people pulling strings that have a lot of power and clout. They never asked me. I was on the banking committee for all those years. I couldn't even go to the open market committee meeting. So there was no way that would be permissible. So it is controlled by outsiders. But and I think that this sort of shows, with two Federal Reserve people in charge at Treasury and at the Federal Reserve, and it's all a rescue operation, and they think they can do it, and they have pulled the rabbits out of the bag many times, and you think this thing isn't going to last, but they end up doing it, and they continue to do it. So they agree on this, but I don't think that it's just a matter of independence. Giving the Federal Reserve more independence has nothing to do with helping the problem, because they're way, way too independent and secretive and out of the control of the Congress. The only thing they could have, the only things that we should be doing, if we seriously want to understand it, is have a thorough audit and find out what goes on behind the scenes, and then get rid of the Federal Reserve. We didn't have a central bank for a long time, and they're all over the world. But like you pointed out, Michelle, they're failing all around the world. The fiscal people are getting together with us. The environmental people want to get ahead in the front of the line, so they get their thing. But it's all of it is put on the weight of believing that they can maintain the integrity of the purchasing power of the dollar, which I do not believe they can continue to do this, because sometimes they even hide the figures of really, what's happening. Even now, it's getting more confusing even to keep up with the money supply figures. They don't reveal it. It's difficult, and say that's not important. But right. Ultimately, is debt motivating all of them to agree that you must print the money in an unlimited fashion, no matter what we say publicly.
All right. So if we are seeing the potential collapse of the dollar, Dr. Paul, what replaces it?
Well, that's the big question, because nobody knows. There's nothing there to replace it right now. If we get into the chaos, which is very possible, that's what's going to happen. You have social destruction. You have something like if it ever got so bad, it'd be like Venezuela, and something like that. I can't believe that we're that stupid to go that far. But no, they need monetary reform. Even if they don't go in the direction I want, they're going to have to do something. But they would have to, politically, it's not likely, because politically, economically, it involves living within our means a little bit, cutting back a little bit of spending. But nobody really is serious, maybe 3 or 4 people. Nobody thinks they're going to cut anything. There's no way that they're going to cut it and improve things in that manner. So they have to start thinking, and I worry about the economic chaos, but also the social chaos that's going on. I live in Texas, and I keep thinking Texas has avoided some of the really dumb stuff in New York City and Chicago and Detroit. But even Austin has street people now with tents out there, and we're a wealthy state and still doing pretty well. But no, this is a consequence of bankruptcy, and they're fidgeting, and they're picking out victims, and they're scurrying around, and but everybody gets a bailout, because they don't have anything else they can do. And that's why you can depend on the destruction of the currency in hopes that they'll wake up and do something. But there aren't very many examples that right in the middle of a chaos like this, they say, oh, let's do common sense. Let's have this vote to cut the budget by 3%. That'd be a civil war. They're going to wait for the civil war that's going to come when you don't cut anything and your purchasing power goes down 10%. Then there'll be real chaos.
So Dr. Paul, how does one protect oneself against this looming chaos? What is the best way to protect one's personal finances? What is the strategy that you would advocate?
Well, there's a couple things. I'm not the financial advisor, but I am one that thinks about survival and investments. But no, I think people should be looking at investments that endure in conditions like that. And that is investing in the precious metals, having land, learning how to take care of oneself and being prepared. But that's being threatened all the time, that even defending yourself now. I talked to somebody the other day about this subject. He says, I have a gun. He says, but I can't even buy ammunition anymore. So they're going to be determined. And that is why the threat really now is they'll do what they have to do. They'll take the guns if they need to. But what else are they going to do when it comes to taking care of the people? They're going to confiscate. They'll confiscate the gold. They did it in the 30s. They'll do it again. Well, I don't really believe they're ready to do that. But that's a threat always, that they'll confiscate the gold. But the government is the threat, and that is why, if you really care about this subject, you have to participate in the preservation of liberty. That's why I like to talk to people at Kitco.
Well, Dr. Paul, let's focus on this threat of potential gold confiscation or one form or other of government intervention, because that concern is rising. We have investment greats like Ray Dalio, Michael Burry saying that safe haven assets are not necessarily going to be so safe from government intervention. They're saying expect possible tax changes or regulation that will prevent a flight of capital to these assets that could be viewed as an alternative to the dollar, like gold, like Bitcoin. Could they be at risk of a government crackdown?
Oh, absolutely. And that's what's not believable. When countries go through, these periods of euphoria where bubbles are blown up, a lot of times people will be taken in, but eventually everybody becomes gullible and they have to try to protect themselves. So these types of euphorias usually end. But that's the reason why, some are going to make it. Some will have their private airplanes. Some will get out of here and some will survive. At the minimum, right now, they're benefiting from the bailouts. The wealthy didn't get poorer in this last bailout. So it's always a threat. But the government is the threat, because they will crack down, because they have the ability to do it. And that's why I'm so positive that we need more people saying, yes, what is this free society you talk about? Well, we had a taste of it. Our Constitution, if you don't know where to start or understand it, just start with the Constitution. That might give you an idea of what a free society is all about. And they say, most people in Washington say that's old fashioned, that we can't do. Nobody cares about that.
So, but Dr. Paul, what form of a crackdown do you think that this could take when we talk about assets like gold and even Bitcoin potentially being at risk of government intervention, at higher taxes, at regulation? What do you think could happen to those assets?
I think all of that can happen. The tax system will be used. But just printing money as a tax, I say all you have to do is spend money and run up the debt. That is a tax, because if people won't loan you the money, which they won't, then they have to print the money, and the devaluation of the currency becomes a tax. So the tax is going up, but they will do it for public relations reason. They will have to show that they're putting a heavy tax on the very wealthy because of the civil strife that's going on. So that will happen. But it's something that should be preventable. It's really hard to take care of once it breaks out. And that's why people are really so scared. But I think there are two parts of it. One is we have the financial bankruptcy. Most people understand it. Too much debt, printing money, borrowing, this sort of thing. But the other is the moral bankruptcy. If you look at it and what's going on in this country with this attack on freedom of speech, and attack on the values of our Western civilization, boy, that is a big deal, and that represents a bankruptcy, a moral bankruptcy, and that is what probably will become more important than just dealing with the financial bankruptcy. But I think they're both, and we have a financial bankruptcy and a moral bankruptcy, and we've never had to go through this quite like this before.
So how do you fight against that, Dr. Paul? How do you fight against the moral bankruptcy combined with a potential financial bankruptcy. You say to champion liberty, that's certainly what you're doing. But what does that mean in effective terms?
Well, I do it by what I'm doing and have done all my life. People say, did you go into politics? I know I never was in politics, never involved, didn't want to be in politics. All I wanted to do was speak out. And that began in the 1970s with actually literally the day after the breakdown of Bretton Woods. And that was August 15th of 1971. That was an impressive moment for me because this is introducing an age of, really bad stuff for us in the world. And of course, gold back then had been 20, went up to 35, and at $35 an ounce, and look at where it's been. Yeah, today it's down, and tomorrow it might be down. But the ultimate protection against it so far through 5,000 years of history has always been the precious metal. And I think they manipulate that price. They try to penalize people who know that and want it. So they manipulate prices of gold and silver. At the same time, they will confiscate it if they have to. I don't think they're on the verge of doing that. But I think that I'm in the education business is what I'm really involved in, homeschooling and trying to get people to understand Austrian free market economics, because if they don't understand that, nothing can come of it, because I think all the bad stuff is a result of bad ideas. We haven't had Austrian economics taught in our schools for the past 50 years. We've been having Keynesian socialist economics that deficits don't matter, and no respect for the Constitution. And this makes a big difference. And they think that they can just do this materialistically. Well, if I print more money and pass it out, everybody's going to be okay. But it's not going to work.